Natalia scrambled down the metal gantry stairs appended to the outside of the giant sail-like megastructure that was the exterior of the Zelenova metropol. The winds from the impending storm were whipping violently at her stained knee-length dress as she struggled to keep her footing. The stairs were creaking under her weight, and she could hear the uncomfortable sounds of rattling in the metal fixtures between the gantry and the metropol exterior. She would have to report that, she said to herself, knowing full well that the metropol maintenance crews would take their sweet time responding to routine requests. It was like that in Zelenova. Corruption was so normalized it had become standard to include kickbacks and other bribes directly into the price of goods and services, almost like a sales tax. Wages were so low and working conditions so utterly horrendous that if you could, you tried to gain a bit of extra funds from wherever, whoever you could. If you had any sort of authority, it was through bribes. Unfortunately for Natalia, she was little more than a line worker in one of the many factories within Zelenova, earning little and possessing no authority to wield. So she had to take other steps to ensure her family was clothed, fed, and had shelter. She reached the threshold of the door and pushed open the metal door, trying to not let it slam close with the wind. She immediately secured it close behind her with a combination of makeshift deadbolts, latches, and even a barricade beam across the frame. Security was a must in Zelenova, with organized crime and petty theft extremely common. Not that Natalia and her family had much that could be stolen. Natalia turned to see her husband, Mikhail, hobbling across the room, closing windows and inserting the mesh panels into the frame to reinforce the glass. His limping movements looked painful as he recovered from an injury, a fracture and contusions after having his leg pinned in a pressing machine. He was lucky to be alive and to have the leg, and his chances of a reasonable recovery were good. But that didn't stop the calls from some in the metropole for Mikhail, Natalia, and their daughter Anya to be sent down, evicted from their company-allocated residence to find their way in the slums below. Fortunately, Natalia had her job and did everything she could to keep them alive and safe while Mikhail recovered. As she closed the door, returning home early ahead of the storm, Mikhail smiled at her knowingly, his pleasant and cheerful demeanor hiding his knowing emasculation. Natalia's foreman didn't let her leave the shift early out of the goodness of her heart, but sacrifices had to be made for family, and she needed to be home for her family, and in particular, for her daughter. Natalia rushed to close the remaining windows and retract the antenna and dishes from the outside of their cubic studio-sized residential unit module. It was a tight squeeze for a family of 3, but she knew of households with 6 or even 8 people living in less than 400 square feet. Even those cramped and overcrowded conditions were better than being sent down to the slums that sprawled around the base of the metropole superstructure. Natalia finished locking down the small apartment and reached out and grabbed a hold of her daughter's diminutive frame, sitting with her on the edge of the cot bed, her arms wrapped around the Anya, cradling her daughter's head and covering her ears as the storm finally struck. These cyclonic megastorms were a common occurrence in the Terminator zone of Ruskan, where the majority of the 100 or so metropoles were positioned. The temperature differential between day and night size of the planet, combined with air and water cycles, fueled storms of unimaginable size that migrated across the planet. The metropoles were designed to weather these events, with the necessary engineering precautions and design adaptations. However, small residential unit modules bolted haphazardly to the exterior of the metropole superstructure were not. Storms hit the metropole 2 or 3 times a year, but it had been many years since there had been one this big. Wind squalls whipped up torrential rains as lightning strikes on the metropole itself boomed with crushing echoes of thunder. Anya screamed at the suddenness of the deafening cacophony, and Mikhail wadded over to his wife and daughter, enveloping them both in his stocky arms just as the unit began to shake. The force of the winds and the rain saw the residential unit module and the surrounding gantry support begin to shudder violently under the cyclonic onslaught as the storm threatened to rip the abode from the walls. A window shattered inwards, despite the support of the metal grate, and rain pelted into the home as the flat roof and walls began to leak profusely. The 3 of them clung together as the biting water and swirling wind now invading their home, their refuge. A large creaking sound of straining and twisting metal could suddenly be heard over the storm, and the module felt a forceful jolt greater than anything to date. Natalia braced herself for the worst as the intense screaming of jagged metal against the exterior surface of the metropol superstructure screamed into her ears. In the midst of the disaster, Natalia's mind turned momentarily to the lessons she had been taught by her babushka of the covenant teachings and the need for repentance. Yet, she pushed away those antiquated, self-defeating notions and instead allowed her heart to fill with hope. She focused on the cool feeling of the green and yellow crystal that hung around her neck against her skin, the gem signifying her devotion to the Resonance Collective, and the hope. No, the trust that everything would be okay. Yet as soon as the grinding and gnawing metallic sound filled her mind, the sound faded away, drowned out by the thunderous, all-encompassing crash of the storm. It was almost half an hour before the peak of the storm passed and the threat to Natalia and her family dissipated. Her daughter whimpered and Natalia clung to her trembling form. It was unfair she had to experience such trauma, yet despite the destructive force of the storm and the drenching rain flooding their meager belongings, they were alive. But others were not so lucky. The family peered out the broken window and saw that 3 of the nearly 500 dwellings attached to the side of the metropol had broken off in the storm, plunging a dozen people in the residence to their deaths 1,000 feet below and no doubt killing countless scores in the slums. It was horrific. They were her friends, her daughter's play buddies, work colleagues. But all Natalia could think of in that moment as she held her daughter and husband peering out at the devastation before them was not sadness or grief. It was relief. She was glad it wasn't her.